Welcome to Exception Handlers, the podcast where CTOs debug the challenges that keep us up at night. I'm Alex.
And I'm Bill, and we're here to deep dive into the runtime errors facing technology leaders today. Those real-world problems that only surface when our systems meet the complexity of actual operations.
This podcast is brought to you by the LA CTO Forum, a professional organization of technology executives in Southern California and beyond. The forum organizes regular events on topics CTOs care about, and one of those events was just recently held. It was a panel discussion about the impact of AI on software development, and we thought we would summarize that discussion for you in this episode. There were 4 topics that were covered, and we're going to go through all of them. The first one was recent changes in AI capabilities. The second was the impact of AI on talent, followed by QA in the era of AI, and finally, AI and legacy code. So let's start with recent changes in AI capabilities. I think one thing that really came up loud and clear was the consensus was models are now good enough to reliably produce code that actually works. And it seems like all that's made possible via the reasoning capabilities, the idea that you can plan, iterate, and then act. And that seems to be a very welcome change to the world of agents. What do you think about that, Bill?
I think that seems to be the one common thread across all of the CTOs, is that they are getting better. The interpretation from that varies really quickly from there, but clearly the work that they're doing right now with each of the models is such a big leap forward than what we had a year ago.
And I actually think not only are the base LLMs getting better, which is definitely the case if you look at GPT-5 or DeepSeek, or 3.5 that just came out yesterday, or Claude 4, Opus, the tooling is also really getting there. So I've had experience with Claude Code and Cursor, and Claude Code in particular really stands out in kind of the user experience around using these agents. I know you've had some experiences with that as well.
Absolutely. And the thing that I really like about it is that they're looking at different ways to express those tools. So to your point on Claude Code, you're down on the command line, you're doing things. You can drop into a directory that's got code in it, fire up Claude and run with it. Yeah. Or you can do something that's more tied to the IDE that's better suited for large groups. So it's the implementation side of this, I think, that's getting really exciting.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I thought was really interesting was, what makes these tools tick is now getting more defined. So Cursor has Cursor rules, Claude has Claude MD. I just recently heard about this becoming a standardized thing with something called Agents MD, but basically the idea that every one of these tools can be given some hints through some documentation on how to do things correctly that match the style and the design of the code base that you're actually in.
Absolutely. And the other side of it, the little more darker side of it is you can already start to see the vendor lockdown starting to creep in.
Yeah. Well, this is the world we're in. It's just unavoidable. Yes, no matter what technology you use, there's going to be
those computes are not going to pay for themselves.
That is very true. That is very true. The other thing that came up that was really interesting, given what we just said, was that some organizations are getting a really meaningful impact from agents. So one company mentioned that they had 83% of all code being generated by AI agents, which is really something if you think about it. They did mention it took them quite a while, maybe a couple of years to really kind of solidify their practices around this. But that's a lot of code being generated by agents.
It's pretty staggering, and I would love to know more about their use case. My understanding is that they're applying it to a lot of legacy code.
Yeah.
That's a very powerful capability with the LLMs these days to go ahead and explore.
They mentioned that not only do they have a pretty old code base, but it grew inorganically over many years of acquisitions, and they've got all kinds of variability in the platforms used, the technologies used, and all that. I mean, they said they had Cold Fusion somewhere in there, and even that was generated by AI, which I was shocked by.
Well, I mean, you got a better chance there, I think, than trying to find the COBOL guy.
Oh my God, that is certainly the case. Yes, actually, that brings me to another thing. COBOL guy has been around for a long, long time, and there's a bunch of junior developers. There was a lot of talk about who is being impacted more in terms of engineering profiles, junior or senior developers. And the common theme that emerged, which I think is really well summarized by this quote, AI is an amplifier and experienced devs are now getting more amplified, which is opposite of that is also true. Junior devs will also get amplified, and to the degree they can't write great code yet, a lot of bad code could get generated real quick. But have you seen that shift happening?
Yeah, and I think the initial expectation by a lot of people, and particularly investors in the startup world, is that this would empower those who were junior to do things that they couldn't before, which to a certain extent is true. The problem is, to your point, is it amplifies everything, including debt. And I've had a lot of experience personally where it has decided to add value, quote unquote, somewhere where I had no idea it was adding value until I went through and did a code review. So I think on many levels, what we're seeing is that senior engineers are having to play the role of code reviewers much more than they did before, because the quote unquote junior developers, AI included, is exploding in terms of the amount of code that's being generated.
You mentioned code review and kind of the focus on that, and we will definitely get to that in the second topic. There are a couple more things I wanted to mention because I just thought it was really interesting. One was this idea that LLM code generators aid in code generation. It sounds a little weird, but basically what it means is you ask your agent to generate some code, and assuming it does a good job, you ask the agent to review the code it just generated and generate a script that would generate similar code in the future. The idea being that to a degree you have kind of common patterns in your code base. Over time, you get a bunch of scripts that the LLMs can leverage to deterministically generate code, and that both saves on tokens, but also variability in what's being generated. I thought that was a really interesting approach. I haven't heard of people doing that before. Have you seen anything like this?
I have not, but it is something that just piqued my interest because I think there's so many places here where there's going to be a multiplicative effect on what they're doing there. You're leveraging your leverage at a certain level.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The other thing that came up as far as kind of the vibe coding capabilities and what that's doing to role definitions, people are talking about now this idea of a product engineer, which is something I've kind of heard of the concept, but haven't actually heard named that way before. And this is the idea that a product manager with a vibe coding tool, Replit or what have you, can generate a prototype, get customer feedback, iterate on that feedback, and then come back to engineering with much more clearly defined requirements and functioning code. Whether engineering decides to hold on to that code or just throw it in the garbage and start fresh almost doesn't matter. What matters is that product managers are getting this superpower to actually build and iterate on code themselves without spending a lot of expensive engineering cycles. And that's product engineering, which, again, interesting idea.
Right. But talk about something that's going to have a large effect on hiring and structure. You blend product and engineering together organizationally, even deeper, but now you wonder, like, what skill set as a product manager should you have?
That is a fantastic segue into our next topic. So the next topic that came up was AI's impact on talent. And you've actually been alluding to, like, what do you even hire for? What do roles even mean anymore? And what do you look for? But even before that, I think one quote that really kind of summarizes the transition and the impact on talent is this idea that every developer needs to become a manager or technical lead of a team of what I call cyber shore agents, because that's basically the world we're going to. And what are the impacts of that, right? A lot more reviewing than writing code, right? That's a big, big thing. Somebody said AI is like the One Ring, where if you wield its power, it can be very powerful, but you must ensure that you're in control of what it's doing. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, again, back to the original point here that it's an amplifier. It's going to take. Let's think for a second about the product manager. The product manager now is knocking out all sorts of stuff with vibe code, and it's got upper management all excited about it, and we're going to move forward, and this is part of the roadmap. What is that deliverable that's being worked with over there? Is that something where that product manager is expected to take it to the next level, like an alpha? Is that something where Figma, we're not using you anymore, now we have stuff that's working models and we discard it and engineering picks up where you left off?
Yeah.
Is it used as an input for engineering on the AI to say, hey, let's start with this, but do it with these other constraints that are in line with our engineering practices? Again, part process, but also major talent differences, because in my experience, the product managers I've worked with in the past would not be able to get very far down this path outside of creating some things that would be a challenge to make work in the real world.
And very much related to that, it also impacts the kinds of talent you want in your engineering team, because if the job is becoming, do a great job explaining what you need to an agent and then do a great job reviewing what that agent generated, that's a little bit different from just write tons of code as quickly as you can, and the impact on the organization is different. So do you hire differently? Do you look for different skill sets in your engineers in addition to your product people?
Yeah, and the other thing just too is just from the psychological standpoint. If you're out there writing your own code, you're setting the pace largely. If you have product managers dumping all sorts of code that they've just come up with on you, there's a whole filtration process that you're going to have to build in, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it used to be, here's an idea, go spec it out. Now here's a pile of code and it's got working buttons and things. Now we need to know what the ramifications are that to get into production, because the CEO is just told we can do this.
Yeah. I mean, it'll create interesting new pressures, I think, on the product organization as a whole, because of the optics involved and what is visible as opposed to what was kind of just implied in the past.
And on the engineering side, on how to absorb, amplify, and deflect things seriously, to the extent, necessary to get things done, because you can only build things so fast. I don't care how much AI you have.
Yes, that's true. There's still bottlenecks. They just look different, and maybe with a different kind of a rate function. One other thing that came up that I thought was related to sort of talent impact, but in a slightly different area, was the hiring has gotten harder. There seems to be universal consensus that first of all, resumes are becoming almost useless as a signal of anything, because back in the day, you had a resume and you might tweak it a little bit to submit it and tailor it to a specific job you're applying for, but there's only so much you could really do by hand. In the days of AI, you can get unlimited number of perfectly tailored resumes to the exact job being posted, and they mean almost nothing because it's very unlikely that the person is even writing them, much less has all the experience on them. So that's an interesting thing. How do you find engineers when you can no longer rely on kind of the things we used to rely on to find people?
Wow. I mean, there's so many layers to this, but you're right. That was already starting to happen in the very early days of AI, and now it's getting demonstrably worse. That said, I think the desire to have junior engineers is dwindling very quickly. Right?
Indeed.
We have a situation where you're wanting more senior engineers, which in that case is point to what you've built. Let me see what you've built.
Yeah.
And then I also think it's going to be kind of a return to, I'm going to call your references because I need to have a conversation with a human being to find out what's really going on over here.
That's very interesting. To the point of, by the way, junior developers not being necessary. A big source of conversation and really concern in this presentation was around the fact that junior dev pathway is disappearing. There are companies that were very open about the fact that they actually have a temporary, at least a moratorium on junior developer hiring. And the rationale for that was, with AI, we have this new ecosystem that we're still sort of grappling with on how to best manage it. And you don't want to bring a junior developer into that environment that's so uncertain and so rapidly shifting, because without guardrails in place, as we talked about earlier, all hell can break loose and they can unleash all kinds of code on the organization that you would need to deal with. But, what do you tell a college kid who's looking to get into this field? What do you tell them to do? Or do you even tell them to bother, or just get out when you still can?
Well, I think, there's still going to be a tremendous need for people who understand the programmatic ramifications of coding.
Right.
To that end, I think that going in the quote unquote standard path of being a junior engineer and working your way up by getting more responsibility is going to change. In my opinion, I think that there's going to be a huge increase in demand on the QA side. And that's because we have these non-deterministic models that are generating a tremendous amount of information and possible answers, which are going to become increasingly more difficult to validate.
We will definitely get to QA in a minute. But before we do, one other thing that I thought is worth mentioning is, in terms of junior developers and how you hire them, I heard this idea for somebody who said, the way we hire junior developers is, assuming these are college kids, we ask them to take one of their student projects, put them up on GitHub, and then we ask, what feature, if you added that feature to this project, would take you a month to do? And then we ask them to do it with AI in a day, and then basically come back to us and tell us what they think about what AI did. Just critique the code. And it's an interesting twist on this because, it sort of forces you to read the code. It forces you to know how to prompt the AI properly. It doesn't really expect you to be able to write a lot of code, but it is trying to understand, can you operate in any capacity in this new world? I thought that was interesting. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that there's going to be a lot of different ways to try and approach this problem. That is certainly one of them. Is if it's the only metric you're doing, I would be a little bit concerned because it does tend very heavily on how much can you generate quickly. And
also, you can ask AI to explain the code and what you think of the code.
Yeah. So again, it's one of many possible ways of doing this.
Yeah.
I still think that on certain levels, being able to talk to somebody who's worked with them. Now, if it's a college kid who's come out and he's got absolutely no experience, I would certainly look at something that is intern-like. So have them come in and in real time do those kinds of things. You're just going to have to try before you buy. There's no other way to do it at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very difficult to really do anything else. But yeah, I mean, the reality of the situation is demand for jobs, and it has just skyrocketed. There was a statistic shared that it used to be 300 to 1. Every opening had about 300 applicants. It's now like 1,500 to 1. And so that is a lot of people trying to find work, and it's very difficult to make sense of who's who. There's
that. In the last 5 years, we've seen the explosion of remote, and that really changed the game.
That's an excellent point. That somehow did not come up, which you're absolutely right. That is actually a big part of what's going on here. Okay. Topic 3, QA in the age of AI. And here, the big focus really was on testing systems that are inherently non-deterministic. I know you have a lot of experience in this area. All kinds of conversations were had about patterns people are using to do this, but just what is your take on how do you actually do this? How do you take a system?
I mean, first and foremost, we all have to accept the fact that these are probabilistic models. So by definition, a certain percentage of the output is going to be garbage. It's going to be, I like to call it the pachinko machine. It makes decisions as it goes down, but it can never go backwards. The way I've dealt with it in my world, doing semantic analysis is I do a combination of things. One is I do what I call the 3-person vote. So in that case, I have a primary who does an evaluation of something. I have a secondary LLM that comes in and also does an evaluation knowing what the primary said. And then I have an adjudicator come in and evaluate between the two, which of the things that it should keep in place and discard. And then I have another model, which I use for doing things like intensity management, where I have them independently look at what was decided upon in previous stages, and then they vote upon it with some level of intensity. And then we do some math operations on it to come up with a score. But at the end of the day, it is important that we try and get something in our world that is consistent in the semantics. It's very hard to do that because there's a lot of nuance and silly things people say in our articles.
Sure.
But there's under no circumstance have we been able to get a single LLM to come back and be consistent enough that you would be able to use it for any kind of an analysis data input. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like the common thing that came up was, LLMs are really not great at just independently and kind of singularly grading things. They're much better at, for example, comparing two outputs and deciding which one is better, or creating kind of a structured evaluation of the thing that they're seeing.
They're amazing at summarization.
True.
Right. But if you're trying to decompose a document, say, or a speech into semantic components, that's the worst thing you can do because it likes to chop things out. And there can be, things that are important in those things that are chopped out.
Yeah. And the other thing that was that came up in this context, and I haven't heard this term before, but I'm sure you have, GRPO, Group Relative Policy Optimization. So this is the idea that a model can generate multiple responses. Another model would then score them. A kind of a group average is computed. There's a comparative advantage figured out for each response, and then based on the best responses, the model gets reevaluated.
Yeah. And again, it's a more structured model than what we're doing. Ours is more of an assembly line in terms of having these kinds of decisions made because we're looking for very discrete bits of information, and we also put the original analysis against a set of our definitions, so it knows what it should be working with, which kind of works until you realize they decide to use synonyms that apply quite well, but are not within your word maps. And then there's all sorts of other layers to it. But I think that kind of model is where we have to go. I just think that the LLMs, the general LLMs, are only going to get so big, and at some point they're going to have to specialize and then become, more of the Mo model. That's my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. The other thing that came up in this section, which is a little bit sort of not directly QA related, but is a little bit, which is this idea of autonomous multi-agent code generation. So somebody gave an example of they have a model that generates the code, they have a model that then validates and critiques that code, and to some degree QAs it.
Yep.
Gives feedback to the first model. The first model then iterates again until some consensus threshold of correctness is reached, and then the human is involved. So this person literally said that they start this thing up at night, kick it off, go to bed, come back in the morning, and then who knows how many iterations later they have a PR in front of them that they can actually review.
Which I would love to see that thing in action. I bet it's really fascinating. Yeah. And secondly, I would love to have that budget.
That came up, as of course you can imagine, these things get expensive. This person, for what it's worth, did say that they weren't even the highest utilizer of tokens in the organization. And he attributed it to the fact that his prompt writing is quite terse, which seems to trigger less token generation and consumption than otherwise. Who knows? But he was pretty casual about the fact that this was working just fine and within reason as far as cost goes.
That's awesome. And I wouldn't be surprised if something like that doesn't start to get built into tools like the client tool we were talking about, or some of the plugins, et cetera, for coding.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the natural next place for something like Cloud Code to go. And in fact, to some degree, it already does this. Like when it creates its plan, at the end of it, it'll try to curl an endpoint and examine the JSON that it's coming back with and see if it matches the requirements. But yeah, this makes a lot of sense to move.
And if it's not separate models, it's separate personas, right? To do something like that, where it internally does this.
Yeah, no, that's actually exactly right. Because you can system prompt it to be more or less judicious about what it's looking at. And yeah, you can make one model act like a QA person and another model act like an engineer. Yeah, absolutely. The last topic that came up was AI and legacy code bases. And this is, we all have experienced legacy code bases and all the implications of managing them, whether there is AI involved or not. Somebody said, and I really like this quote, legacy code is bad code that you still use because it makes you money. So you have to sort of deal with it no matter what. As far as AI specifically, the thing that came up was this idea of focusing on agent experience versus developer experience. So things like help your agent do better with legacy code by documenting it in chunks, creating a graph of the code that it can use as input in addition to the code itself so it can make better sense of it. What have you seen in this area?
I haven't seen a lot, but what I have seen has been impressive. And I mean, again, going back to our point that AIs are great at doing summarization. They're great at spelunking, right? They get down in the cave and they're looking around for all sorts of evidence of finding things, and also documenting it, getting a mermaid chart out of some of this stuff, which has heretofore been this black box that the guys who don't work here anymore worked on, or heaven forbid. So from that standpoint alone, it is such a leg up on being able to tackle how do we bring these things into the modern age? Or what's our risk? I mean, think about it. You got old stuff like that. A lot of it is in a security wasteland. It has not been touched or modified. There's so many places where there's possible exposures, and being able to send a system down there and to take a look at it, I think is a really big area of future value I think we're going to get out of these things.
I absolutely agree. I think as far as legacy code bases, obviously they have different challenges than Greenfield for AI, but agents can help a lot, especially with tackling some of these issues you're talking about.
Yeah, and I have a very silly little example, but I had old PHP code that was done a long time ago for a website for a charity foundation, and they wanted me to make a change for it. And I'm like, okay, geez, what am I going to do? I dropped in Claude Code. I went in there. I quickly figured out what was going on. I asked it for a couple of options, generated the code, threw it out there, and it worked. This saved me hours and hours of time. I haven't worked with PHP in a long time, right? Yeah. And the architecture on that is what it is. I don't remember it. It's been, I didn't document it well because the time I just knocked it out. This was a game changer. It's very simple. Yeah. And that's just a very simple case. Imagine something millions of lines of code.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, to that point, some of the newer models have pretty large context windows, so they can actually consume. I was reading just today that I think Cloud Code 4 Opus can take in like 75,000 lines of code because of its context window. So that's a lot of code to look at and make sense of. The other thing that I thought was really interesting in this context, so this idea that legacy code is often problematic because of how complex it is due to all the various configuration that you can do for different client reasons and stuff like that. So for a given client, it's quote unquote simple. But once the combinatorial explosion of all these configuration options comes together, the code base is incredibly complicated. And so somebody was saying, well, why even bother with that? And one person was saying that, in their organization, they're now creating sort of bespoke versions of their software per client because it's cheaper and simpler to deal with that than have one massive thing that can accommodate all these clients with all these different requirements and options. I think that's a really interesting direction that this is moving in.
It certainly has various pluses to it, right?
Right.
Even if you're going down the forbidden path of basically forking your code multiple times, think about the ramifications back to the security thing, right?
Right.
Now you're implementing libraries that have been updated in the last 10 years.
Right.
You're looking at stuff that can be treated specifically for the very first quote, which is, it's making us money. Is this client still here, right? Is that whatever we had to do for them, do we still need to do it?
Yeah.
And I also think this is kind of knocking on the doorstep of taking these kinds of things and breaking the world down into tiny agents. It's the SOAP dream come true. And because now the code is manageable with an AI, the question is can it be modified to be able to keep track of all these services sitting on the wire, these agents sitting on the wire?
What I think is really interesting about this whole thing, and I completely agree with you, by the way, the very fact that AI is being used is almost forcing people to rethink what good architecture is, what good code means, because a lot of what we do and have done historically have been sort of used to certain assumptions that you have to maintain all this code and it's expensive and it's difficult. But AI is kind of a game changer. And so it lets you think of it very differently, and different constraints apply, and old constraints no longer apply. The fascinating world.
And you also have the added quote benefit that it can choose the language that's best suited for this. You're no longer, we're a Java shop or we're a Go shop or we're a Rust shop. It doesn't matter. If PHP happens to be the right thing for this little thing that opens the back door at 3 a.m., why not?
Fundamentally, and I think this quote really sums it up, the idea that AI can create new technical debt to replace your old technical debt. But since the debt can be created in a day, it can be rewritten and replaced in a day. So the economics of technical debt is bad may no longer apply because it's so cheap to just replace it with something else. It's really interesting. It really is interesting.
Yes. As we all migrate into becoming AI farmers.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I think that concludes the summary of the conversation that the LA CTO Forum put together. It was really interesting. And by the way, if you found these topics relevant, the LA CTO Forum has lots of opportunities like this to engage with other CTOs about topics just like it. So if you're interested in learning more, you can find us on LinkedIn or visit us on the web at lactoforum.org. Until next time, may your deployments be smooth and your tech debt manageable.
And remember, if you can't handle the exception, at least log it properly. We'll catch you next time.